Welcome to In Conversation, a monthly podcast that takes a deeper look into everything we're working on here at Long Road. Tune in to hear more from our contributors, editors, and experts who are part of the journalism we publish and the stories we tell. I'm Faranisa Campana, and this week we'll hear from Antony Loewenstein, a journalist and author. In his latest book, Loewenstein explores how Israeli technology used to enforce its occupation of Palestinian territory has been exported across borders around the world. Published by Verso Books on May 23rd, the Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World, mentions early in its pages the harrowing story of Loewenstein's grandparents, Jewish refugees who fled Nazi Germany and Austria and ended up in Australia. It's a grim, deeply researched book that digs into the global politics that have allowed Israel to turn Palestinians into test subjects for surveillance and military technology, and Palestine itself into a testing ground. The publication of the Palestine Laboratory comes shortly after the 75th anniversary of what Palestinians know as the Nakba, the violence and ethnic cleansing that destroyed hundreds of Palestinian villages, scattered hundreds of thousands of Palestinians outside the borders of their country, and led to the creation of the Israeli state. It also comes after a recent spike in Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, the besieged coastal enclave where some 2 million Palestinians live. Loewenstein and Long Road editor Patrick Strickland recently sat down to chat about the Palestine Laboratory, the Israeli technology used on European and North American borders, and the borders Israeli forces impose on Palestinians.
Congratulations on the publication of the Palestine Laboratory. We could just kind of hop in, and one of the things early on in the book that you mention was how your grandparents actually fled Nazism in Europe as refugees themselves. And you've been reporting on Israel-Palestine for a long time now. I lived there from around 2011 to 2015, and I remember your work pretty clearly from that time as well. And I remember, I think you had a couple books come out around that time as well. One was a compilation, I believe, right? Like an anthology on Zionism.
Exactly. Yeah. It was various people, Palestinians, Israelis, and Jews and Arabs, just talking about what would happen if or when Zionism ended and what a equitable democratic state would look like.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask first, how that experience as someone whose own grandparents had in fact fled genocide has impacted your approach to reporting on Israel and Palestine over all these years.
As I sort of say in the beginning of the book, and I've been writing about it elsewhere, I don't generally write a lot about my own personal history, but I do introduce, I guess the subject was partly in a conversation with Verso, my publisher, about doing it that way for a variety of different reasons. But yeah, I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and which at the time when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s had one of the highest percentages of Holocaust survivors in the world outside of Israel. A lot of Holocaust survivors ended up in Australia for different reasons, both in 39 as the war was beginning, but also after the war, 45 and onwards. And I grew up in a liberal Jewish home. For many people listening, maybe who are Jewish or have Jewish friends or family, it's pretty typical then and still really now that Israel is something that you support. It's what you're expected to support. It's something that we apparently are kind of born into, this idea that Israel, not so much as the promised land, I never got told that myth, but more as a potential escape route. God forbid another Nazi type regime emerges. As some listeners may not know, as a Jew, and if you can prove that you're Jewish, and the way Israel does that is very problematic for a range of reasons, but essentially if you can prove that you're Jewish, namely your mother was Jewish, you can go to Israel, and within probably 2 or 3 months you're going to have a passport. You'll be an Israeli citizen. And I don't have an Israeli passport. I won't get one on principle, but the idea of Israel being a safe haven was something I grew up with, and a lot of Jews, I think, did in the past, and I think still now do. I think it's changing a little bit, which we can talk about if you want. But the idea that my family were mostly killed in the Holocaust, the vast majority did not survive, which course, is a very typical Jewish European story. They were in Germany and Austria. Many of them ended up in Auschwitz, and they were exterminated. And the ones who got out in 1939, just before the war, ended up anywhere that country would accept them: Australia, Canada, US, UK. None, as far as we're aware, went to, of course, Palestine wasn't Israel then, but it was Palestine. But no one went there, as far as I'm aware. So it was a big part of my upbringing. The idea that when I was taught all the myths, I went through all those processes. We're the chosen people. I mean, I said I speak as then and now as a secular Jew. I mean, we're not religious. And I think for many Jewish people, Israel's become their religion. It is their religion. It's replaced any kind of traditional religiosity, going to synagogue, and even very liberal Jews might go to synagogue maybe on Passover or some other major Jewish holiday. But in general, Palestinians were invisible. When I say invisible, in the Jewish community, Palestinians were not heard from. They were not talked about, apart from being demonized. And of course, I grew up before the internet, which I think makes a big difference, because I don't use this as an excuse, but as an explanation, it was more difficult to get the Palestinian point of view and to hear of Palestinians in the media. Back then, Palestinian voices were largely absent. So many in the Jewish community, the Israel lobby, my family, demonized Palestinians, demonized Arabs. They were said to be the new Nazis. They wanted to kill us all, push us into the sea. Yasser Arafat, who was the then leader of the Palestinians, was deemed the new Hitler. This was the narrative. And I'm not saying I entirely bought into it, but I guess to some extent I did a little bit. It's hard not to when you're 10 or 11 or 12. As time went on, I started to question it more. I felt very uncomfortable with the kind of racism I was hearing around the family table, around the Sabbath meal on the Fridays if I was with my family. And by the time I got to university in the mid-90s, again, mostly before the internet, I started reading more widely. And the time I went to Israel, Palestine for the first time in 2005, I was researching my first book, My Israel Question. I mean, then my views are quite different even to now. I mean, I said I was a believer in a two-state solution. I would have called myself a Zionist, neither of which I believe anymore, but that's what I thought, 20 odd years ago. That I think it was seen back then, certainly by many Jews, and I'm not saying there weren't Jews who were anti-Zionist. Absolutely they were. But it was seen as a major step to essentially say you don't believe that Israel should be a Jewish state because it discriminates against non-Jews, essentially, amongst many other reasons. And my argument then, although it's much more cogent now, is that I don't support the concept of a Christian, Muslim, or Hindu, any religious state. All those nations, by definition, are discriminatory. I talk a lot in the book about India, which, of course, is now the world's biggest nation and a very close ally of Israel, and is an ethno-nationalist, increasingly Hindu fundamentalist state. So, yeah, like a lot of Jews, I guess I've been on a journey, both metaphorically, literally, and with my family. Just finally, over the years, a lot of my family or Jewish friends, through my parents, just basically disowned my parents because I was being too critical of Israel. I didn't really ever have any very close Jewish friends who were very Zionist, but any Jewish person you speak to who grew up in that community who is critical of Israel will have very similar stories. Ostracization, I'm dining with the devil, I'm palling around with terrorists, why am I siding with the Arabs over the Jews? I'm self-hating, I'm a Nazi lover, I've had death threats, all the sadly fairly typical things. I don't say that to be a victim by any means, just to give people a bit of context about what it can be like for a Jewish person who's very critical of Israel.
Yeah, and of course, any discussion of, Israel and Palestine, borders are somewhat of a central issue, which is a bit ironic because Israel's borders are constantly in a state of flux in a way, not exactly recognized, the borders that are imposed upon, say, Palestinians. And there's a lot of different issues related to that. I mean, there's millions of Palestinian refugees across the map of the world, not even just the Middle East. One of the things that's really interesting that you write about too, though, is the grim prospects of people who flee Africa as refugees and make the journey to Israel. A lot of them end up in South Tel Aviv. I wanted to ask, what's Israel's record sort of when it comes to dealing with, for instance, Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers, among others?
Terrible is the short answer. Certainly over Israel's history, there have been moments where certain African refugees who were Jewish have been accepted in not massive numbers. For example, Ethiopian Jews at various points in Israel's history have been taken in and given citizenship, although many other Ethiopian Jews have not been. And in fact, there are a lot of other, particularly dark-skinned and black Africans and others who have claimed to be Jewish, who Israel has simply not accepted. I mean, this I think is very much, I see Israel today as really a manifestation of a form of white supremacy. And I say that because there is profound racism against Arabs for sure, but against Africans. When it comes to, for example, Eritreans, Sudanese, South Sudanese, and various other Africans who many years ago maybe entered Israel via one of the borders, some of them feature in the book, and I've kept in touch with some of them. Some of them remain in Israel. Some of them then left because of the massive racism against them and tried to find, I guess, greener pastures. One ended up in Germany and took a, dangerous boat ride across the Mediterranean. So there's lots of crazy stories like that. But there's profound racism. I mean, you have leading Israeli politicians, leading Israeli rabbis. I mean, I quote some of them in the book, and people can Google this if they either don't believe me or want to see what I'm talking about. This is a level of, it's sort of more than racism. There's a degree of dehumanization, of not really viewing them as, they're not Jewish, but as equal citizens, as equal people, that they should be ostracized and essentially kicked out. And in the last 20 years, I can't give you the exact number, but the number of African refugees that Israel has accepted as citizens because they are legitimately fleeing persecution is minuscule. I mean, I think it potentially is 10, if not less. I mean, unbelievably small. And these are people who are legitimately fleeing from persecution: Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea. And one of the crazy aspects, I only feature this a little bit in the book, but just so people get a bit of a taste of it, other people have written more about it, is Israel in the last 10 or so years has tried to strike deals with all these repressive African states to essentially bribe them. So they go to an African migrant in, say, Tel Aviv, and they say, right, your application for refugee status has been refused. You're not allowed to stay here anymore. But don't worry, we've organized a wonderful one-way ticket to, say, Uganda or Rwanda. We'll give you $3,500 US. And when you get there, you'll be assisted to find a job. And initially, of course, people thought, okay, this sounds okay. I mean, soon became very clear it was all a lie. And I met a number of these African migrants who are forcibly sent from Israel to, as I said, Uganda or Rwanda. They arrive there, their passports are taken by authorities, they're not given jobs. Many of them decide to leave and try to find greener pastures. I met some when I was living in 2015 in South Sudan, of all places. South Sudan is a war zone. I mean, yes, it's an African nation, but it has very few resources, very poor, not many jobs. So the idea that you have Israel, a nation that was founded under the guise of protecting Jews after the Jewish people's most catastrophic event, the Holocaust, and yet decades later, and frankly in all Israel's history, but certainly in the last couple of decades since 2000, there has been a ramping up, not just of rhetoric against Africans, but an attempt to kind of almost offshore the problem, so to speak. And I say that because I've spent, as an Australian, although I've lived many years outside of my own country, I'm currently in Australia now. I'm sure many listeners will be aware that Australia has a notorious refugee policy, often forcibly sending refugees who are coming by boat to small Pacific islands, Nauru, Papua New Guinea. those nations are bribed to essentially accept these refugees and house them in incredibly poor conditions. There's been riots and rapes and death and murder and a horrendous record. And increasingly, Australia was a model for, I think, a lot of what the EU is doing, and in fact, what parts of the US. I'm not saying European refugee policy is solely dictated by Australia. It's not. I've done a number of stories in the last years for various outlets, some of which I quote in the book, of Australia's refugee policy of so-called offshoring, sending people to places that A, don't get much media attention or media coverage, and they're kind of almost invisibilized. And that's what Israel was trying to do by sending desperate refugees who, by the way, in any rational, humane country would have been granted refugee status, because many of them, if not most of them, were fleeing persecution. I mean, if you're coming from Eritrea, which has been for decades a repressive state that was forcing particularly young men into conscription to fight an insane war against Ethiopia, a lot of people fled, and rightly so. The idea that someone like that, and I met some of them in South Sudan and in Israel, are not granted refugee status is absurd. But that's what Israel was doing. And there's very little opposition in Israel to that. Of course, there are some Israeli Jews who oppose it, absolutely, and some Palestinians for that matter. But in general, it's supported. Expel them, get rid of them, send them back to Africa, not our problem, which is partly because of racism and also partly because a lot of Israeli Jews who are much more hardline, which I would argue is probably the majority, don't want black-skinned people in their country. I mean, they openly say it. It's not me guessing. I mean, you have huge numbers of people and quotes and rabbis and politicians and activists saying this. It's pretty shocking for a Jew, I have to say, pretty shocking.
Right. And another thing you write about is that the Israeli arms industry is in fact involved in supplying weapons that get used in a number of crises of displacement. I think you mentioned, for instance, Israeli arms that go to Myanmar, and as you just mentioned a moment ago, also to South Sudan and elsewhere. How would you characterize Israel's involvement in these sort of displacement crises around the world? Are there any flashpoints in particular that we should, know about that are maybe not so much discussed?
I mean, I think South Sudan is an interesting example. South Sudan is mostly ignored in much of the Western media. And I say that having lived there in 2015, often trying to get media interest was challenging, to put it mildly, by Western media outlets. But I think Israel sells weapons for principally two reasons. One, for the obvious one, it's a moneymaker. It's capitalism. That's why the US sells arms, why France does, why a lot of nations sell weapons. They do it to make money and to get influence, I guess, in the hope that by selling weapons to nation X or nation Y, that country will thank them in different ways. What does that mean? It could be voting at the UN in a certain way, which is what Israel often hopes or pushes for when they make these kind of dirty arms deals. But I think there's also something else, that a reason why Israel sells a lot of these weapons. And when we're talking about weapons here, it's everything from rifles, the most basic kind of weapon, so to speak, to something much more, spyware, missile defense shields, a range of other tools, so-called smart walls, facial recognition, biometric tools. There's a range of things. And when I give lots of examples, as you say in the book, if you think of any extreme conflict pretty much in the last 50 or 60 years, and the moment when that conflict is at its most extreme. I mean, Rwanda, during the genocide, evidence that Israel was selling weapons to the regime during the genocide. Myanmar was committing genocide in around 2016, 2017 against the Rohingya Muslim population, many of whom were either killed or forcibly kicked out to Bangladesh, and that's kind of where they are now in this never-ending nightmare limbo. Israel was sending forms of spyware and other kind of weapons, rifles, etc. And in the UN report about that genocide, where it actually called it genocide, Israel was named as contributing to that. So on the face of it, you would think, gee, that's pretty outrageous, pretty shocking. And what happens? Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Now, when I say nothing happens, as in Israel doesn't really change its policy towards selling weapons to these states. And there are countless others. I mean, I list them in the book and go into some detail so people really get a sense of the scale of it. pretty much every corner of the globe, South and Latin America, Africa, Asia, and democracies. I'm not just talking about dictatorships. Obviously, we've listed dictatorships there, but they sell a lot of weapons to other nations too, so-called democracies, and weapons could be spyware, hacking tools, getting access to people's iPhones or Android phones. I mean, what's the ideology behind it? Money, influence, but also I think, and I say this in the book, and it's something I wanted to really stress, was some of it is also trying to foster a kind of global community of like-minded nations. And that's important. So when, for example, Israel sells spyware or hacking tools to South Sudan, it's not really a like-minded nation. They're doing it because they want somehow influence in the world's newest nation, and they maybe hope that South Sudan will vote with them in a certain way at the UN when a vote comes up about settlements or some kind of policy. So there's not really an ideological alignment there beyond, a transactional friendship or relationship. But when it comes to a country like, say, India or Hungary, then it's a bit different. India obviously is the world's biggest nation now, population-wise, self-described democracy, run in the last 10 years or so by Prime Minister Modi, who's a, frankly, Hindu fundamentalist, who's wanting to create and is building a Hindu fundamentalist state. Muslims are discriminated against. And I'm not arguing that India is doing all this because of Israel. Of course, that's not true. But what India is doing, and they openly have senior Indian officials, and I quote some of them in the book, are admiring what Israel is doing in the West Bank, namely bringing in Jewish extremist settlers to kick Palestinians off their land. And that's what they want to do in Kashmir. Kashmir obviously has been a flashpoint for decades. It's a Muslim majority area. And what India is increasingly doing in the last years is bringing great numbers of Hindus from the main part of India, on the mainland, to try to dilute the Muslim population. And that is inspired by Israel. Undeniably it is. I mean, Indian officials say it themselves. So arms trading can be, yes, transactional. I mean, brutal, but transactional. But increasingly, I think Israel is trying to build a kind of loose, unofficial coalition of like-minded states. And Hungary is another one. Just briefly, Hungary is obviously a relatively small country, 10 million people or something. It's tiny, really. But Orban, its leader, has I think, disproportionate influence in Europe, frankly. And I think he's very close to Netanyahu in Israel. Also believes that he wants to create a kind of Christian ethno-state. I think he's continuing to do that. The world is pretty much standing by while he does. That obviously impacts his refugee policy, his border policies, all those issues. And he's not just close to Israel, but has bought a lot of Israeli technology, spyware, spying on Hungarian dissidents and journalists and human rights workers and all those kinds of people, critics of Orban, essentially, or Orbanism. And I think that's another country where, yes, Hungary is not the influence of India, of course, but there is an ideological alignment. And more countries, I think, are finding that Israel is the model. Israel is the ultimate ethno-nationalist model. It's been going for 3/4 of a century. It has complete global impunity. No one's stopping it doing a damn thing. And it's now the 10th biggest arms dealer in the world, which is not bad for a massively tiny country. So I think a lot of countries look to Israel as an inspiration. And that might not be what a lot of listeners to this podcast think is sane. I certainly don't think it's sane, but I can see why a lot of nations do view Israel in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Hungary, I was just there in January reporting on pushbacks, and that's one of these, easily one of the most important and disturbing developments the last few years when it comes to the EU and its border policies. You discuss in the book also the Israeli technology cropping up, on Europe's external borders. What kind of technology is cropping up, but also, what does it mean for people making that journey? I mean, I think at one point you mentioned the Heron drone and the fact that it had been flown over Gaza for quite some time and was now being used in the Mediterranean to surveil people on boats trying to reach a place to apply for asylum.
I mean, listeners to this podcast will obviously know quite a lot about, I guess, the European border policy, which I'll get to in a minute, just in the context of Israel. But yes, a lot of what Israel sells and promotes is what they call battle tested. They openly say it. Battle tested meaning it's been used in Palestine, over Palestine, or on Palestinians. So yes, a number of drones, the Hermes drone and the Heron drone, both Israeli drones, have been used over Gaza and over the West Bank, sometimes armed, sometimes not. And they've been used for years by Elbit, is one of the main companies, Israel's leading defense company. And that is part of the sales pitch. That's the appeal. You have European nations, the EU, Frontex, the border, so-called security apparatus, the US, which we can get to in a minute if you'd like. They find that very appealing, that it's been used in Palestine, in inverted commas, successfully. So in the last years, and this of course massively accelerated after the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. I mean, I would argue it wasn't a crisis, it was a created crisis, but how it was reported and how many European nations eventually saw it was they didn't want a repeat of that. They did not want any kind of repeat of huge numbers of brown, black bodies trying to enter the EU, coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, in those kinds of numbers. You know, I think there was roughly, a million, mostly Muslims who came into Germany in 2015. And of course, other people, refugees went to other nations in Europe. So the EU made a pretty clear decision that they were going to, frankly, I would argue, ghettoize themselves as much as possible. And there was a range of ways they were trying to do that, of course, and you've reported on some of that very, very well. So I won't sort of repeat all that now. But the Israeli connection to that is that the EU and Frontex uses Israeli drones to monitor parts of the Mediterranean 24/7, every day of the year. These drones are not armed, they're unarmed, but they are essentially the eyes in the sky. And the reason that's relevant is that, of course, the EU in the last years has made a very clear policy decision. Of course, they don't admit this or acknowledge it, but this is the reality. They've decided they want to let people drown and die in the ocean. I mean, you cannot get a more cynical, brutal policy than that. And they've done that by essentially not just trying to criminalize rescue boats from taking people out of the water to take them to dry land and safety and be processed, etc., but they are actively advocating people either being left to drown. And the Israeli drones are the eyes in the sky that allow Frontex to see who is on the water, where they are they in trouble, do they need help? And in very, very few cases, of course, yes, help is sent, but in the vast majority of those cases, those people are then taken, if they're lucky, to one of the handful of European NGOs that are essentially Sea-Watch, one of them, which I talk about in the book, who are, of course, are massively outgunned. I mean, they're just, rescue boats, and I admire what they do hugely. They're, I think, inspiring, but they can't exactly monitor the Mediterranean. They've got a handful of boats. And the people the EU do rescue, so to speak, are often given to the Libyan Coast Guard to then be taken to Libya, which essentially has slave auctions. I mean, this is the reality of EU border policy. And as you say, pushbacks is part of that. So Israel plays a key role in this, a key surveillance role. And because the European Union has admired, and of course the EU, just briefly and finally, EU is Israel's biggest trading partner. It's the biggest trading partner. I mean, often you find people saying, well, the Europeans are pretty critical of what Israel does, namely in Palestine. It's a fig leaf. It's all nonsense. Yes, sometimes the EU puts out a statement. They're very disturbed about settlements, or maybe a few other Western European nations occasionally put out stronger statements. But ultimately, because the EU is based on consensus, and the consensus is you want to keep refugees out, that's what wins in the end. So, the European Union, I mean, obviously there are European nations that are more critical than others. Hungary and Poland obviously are madly pro-Israel. A nation like Belgium's a little bit more critical, but overall, there's no consequences for Israeli action. So